I'm still at 1,000 feet. The fire was actually lapping my face, my neck, my scalp. Through the open door aperture, get onto the left wing, and I'm trying to hastily bring the aircraft in. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. I got away with that at the skin of my teeth. I did that because the cockpit was a blazing inferno. Hyperextended left index finger, fractured. 2 ribs, fractured. Collarbone, fractured. I was faced with some hideously dire options. The surgeons in America gave me only 5% probability of survival. I looked like something that divers had fished out the River Thames. The insurance was just shy of 2.8 million US dollars. It was a massive shock to the system, that's what I'm trying to say. Any essence of who I was before, gone.
Hello and welcome to the Behind the Screens podcast with me, Curtis.
And me, James.
Today we are joined by a very, very special guest. We have Jamie with us today. I'm not going to do him a disservice and summarise your life into a one intro line. I think this is one where everybody needs to settle in, get yourself a cup of tea and really listen. So thank you so much for coming on, Jamie. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Great to be here, and I'm impressed with the swankiness of your new studio. Looks good.
Thank you.
It's all Curtis's hard work.
Well, I'll take it. I'm glad you're a fan. But yes, Jamie, I'd love to just dive into your story. I think it would be great to start with, kind of a background on yourself, maybe a little bit about growing up, and we can maybe dive all the way through.
Sure. So I was born in Luton, actually, a very long time ago. We lived in Stopsley, which is kind of like, I considered it sort of posh end of Luton. My grandparents were up there, and we were very close to them. Grandfather was a engineer at British Aerospace Engineering, not a million miles from Stopsley, towards sort of Hitchin Way. Massive inspiration to me when I was a young kid. And what I do distinctly remember was going to Luton Airport when I was a young boy, because Grandad was a bit of a spotter with the whole aircraft scene, given, I think, what he did for a living. He was a sort of an engineer / analyst for all things aeronautical and missiles. But he was massively into aircraft, took me to Luton Airport. And what I often like to share with people is that I used to get quite close to the action. And there I was looking through this kind of perimeter fence, and I'm looking through the metal mesh of the fence. And I'm also with a broken binocular. And it's me, my grandfather, my little brother was there as well. And I'm watching the pilots in the distance on the tarmac at Luton Airport, sort of throttling up the engines. And that was a real spectacle for me as a young boy. So I was like six years of age, perhaps some of my earliest memories. And the noise, of the jet engines in the distance, and what the pilots were busying themselves in anticipation for the flight, and the smell, the fumes of the kerosene coming downwind. And so I was moved by that. I was inspired, and perhaps I figured one day, it would be something that I'd love to perhaps have a go at when I'm older. So yeah, that was my youth, Luton.
Keen really now to fast forward a few years. I think your character is very obvious from an early age, but that translates then to your time. You're now in the US. You are learning to fly. Where did obviously you had the passion for airplanes from an early age. When did you decide you wanted to learn to fly?
Yeah, so realistically, again, it stemmed from those very early exposure. I remember as a young kid, I'm sat on my grandfather's knee, as you do, and he's telling me all these stories about all things kind of aeronautical, aviation, and even space. And I was mesmerised, I was hooked, and I'd ask him a lot of questions and get a lot of good feedback, because he was a knowledgeable man in that department. He trained as a pilot as well himself during the war, towards the back end of that. So I was very much inspired by him, and as I mentioned, I figured when I was older, I wanted to kind of talk the talk and perhaps put my money where my mouth was. So that I did. And by that stage, I was a young soldier, actually, in service with UK Special Forces, and I'd been doing that for a number of years. But I was due to go on a big tasking to Afghanistan. So the story goes that I had a bit of downtime, and I decided again to walk the walk on that downtime, use it to effect before I was due to go off on a tasking. And I actually went to Florida because the chances are I was going to fulfill the dream and the plan to learn to fly, so specifically light aircraft, single engine piston. That's what I was going for. And it was, the incentive was it was relatively cost effective to go to Florida in terms of what was on offer. The weather systems there were pretty good, i.e. I wasn't going to get rained off. Like perhaps if I was going to do it in the UK, it may take a lot longer to achieve because of the kind of rainy seasons that we're subject to in the weather here. And I went to Florida. I'm working on the eastern seaboard of United States, and if I fast forward, I've gone from being pilot in command, so having done what I've done with the instructors for a period of 2-3 weeks, and I get signed off to go PIC, pilot in command, so solo. And I'm solo.
So after 2 weeks, you're allowed to go on your own?
Yeah, so I'm now solo, qualified to go on my own without supervision. And I'm doing the business, and I'm flying within that local Florida airspace. And I make a flight from Aerodrome A Alpha, which was the small aerodrome where I was operating, and I go Aerodrome B Bravo, which is about 10 kilometers away. I land, this was in the morning, I then taxi back out, take off. B Bravo wasn't manned with local municipal air traffic control, so I'm able to talk to other air traffic control, and then take off again, and then fly 10 kilometers back to Aerodrome A Alpha and land. This was the 19th of August 2007. I came in for lunch, let's just say refreshment, a bit of downtime, probably a couple of hours duration period at the local flight training center. And then during that time, I was able to sort of reset myself, check weather, check the radar, look at the weather systems. Now, typically on that day, like many days, a weather system swept through. So we're talking some torrential rain. It was visibly apparent on the radar. When I say it sweeps through, it takes no more than 20 minutes or so. And it comes all the way through, it dumps on the ground and sort of saturates, and then it's gone. And then skies will gradually clear again. And we're talking sort of bluebird, sort of Simpsons weather. A few puffy clouds, blue sky, and we're good to go, providing I get the permissions and I'm back up. So that's exactly what happened. And I went back up in the afternoon, 19th of August 2007. So on the ground, I do a few checks regarding the aircraft, make sure that she's still airworthy. I'm checking flaps, ailerons, rudders, wings, condition of tyres, and so on. It was all good. Got in the aircraft, did all my pre-flight checks, shout, clear prop, and I start the engine, and I do like my various kind of instrumentation and control checks, and I taxi out a little bit. I do some checks regarding sort of RPM, sort of engine power checks. Then I taxi round to the threshold, so the point where I'm going to take off and cross that threshold. I get permission at every stage, and I'm gone. So I'm down the centre line, and then before I know it, I'm sort of pulling back on the stick at sort of about 55 knots with the stick in between my legs. One hand on the control stick, therefore one hand on the throttle. At this stage, I'm full throttle. I look for the airspeed indicator at what I need, and I pull back, and I'm airborne, and I've got wind under the wings that's lifting me, okay, and I'm airborne, and so I'm back up into that airspace again the afternoon, 19th of August, and I do a couple of concerted movements within that pattern. So I'm coming around within the pattern at 1,000 feet. I'm working between 1,000 and 1,200 feet indicated on altimeter. So I'm over the ground at that height above ground. And as I'm going around, I'm literally doing a couple of passes. I'm doing a couple of touch and goes as well. And that was the plan. And all I was doing at that stage of the game was hour building. So my goal was to generate more hours come end of flight, log it in the logbook, and then job done at the end of the day, come back, repeat process, move on. I'm looking to get X amount of set hours, and then I would have done a quick flight debrief and flight sort of check flight with one of the local kind of instructors / examiners, and I'd have been done. And I was literally only 2 days away from that on the 19th of August 2007. However, on this one particular day, I look out my left-hand canopy window, and during one of the movements within the pattern, I'm specifically coming downwind, overhead, so over 1,000 feet indicated. I look out the left-hand window. I saw thin orange, yellow flame, and it's coming from the front of the aircraft, and I have to do a double take, and I'm like, I look, that means, and I look again. I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, is that what I think it is? And sure enough, it was flame originating and drawing out from the front aspect of the engine fuselage. And my mind is starting to race about this situation that I'm in and this scenario. I have to go not only downwind, but left banking turn crosswind, and then left banking into wind. And as I make the final turn into wind, I'm still at 1,000 feet. In doing so, with that increased pressure on the front of the aircraft, the fire immediately breached the cockpit internally. How did I know? Because simply put, I looked down at my feet on the rudder pedals and I saw the flame ingress and breach. And so flame is starting to lap around my feet and ankles. And at that stage, I cannot deny that my mind is not only racing, but my mind is starting to panic. So with that, I get this kind of upwelling surge within the body, and I'm feeling, if you like, the adrenaline response, and the heart is kind of boom, boom in my chest, and my breathing rate elevates, and I'm sort of, I'm hyperventilating, thinking about everything's going on, trying to process everything that's going on. My obvious goal was to try to get the aircraft down towards that threshold point for the landing. But in doing so, and I'm trying to hastily bring the aircraft in doing so, I'm watching altimeter spin down through sort of 800 feet, 700 feet, 600 feet. But the fire down below is building. I got to about 500 feet, and the fire is around about the belly height, so mid sort of chest, within the small chamber of a two-seater cockpit. And we're talking a single-engine piston light aircraft. I've got nowhere to go. People have asked me, did you not have a parachute? No, you don't wear a parachute. People have asked me, did you have an ejector seat? No, there's no such thing in, we're talking not such a sophisticated light aircraft. And I'm stuck. I'm between a rock and a hard place, like literally. I'm, obviously below 1,000, but like I mentioned, 500 feet. Fire is midway within the chamber of the cockpit. So by my rough estimation, if I get to threshold and contact point for the runway, 0 in other words, fire is potentially going to be overhead because of the rough timeline and the rough estimate of what's gone on already. Fire is thereby going to overwhelm me, and it was a no-brainer. So with that, if you like, the kind of hasty estimate in my mind, I thought, this is not happening. I don't think I'm going to make it to the contact point and roll into a full-stop halt without that fire overwhelming me. So I thereby decided to pull the stick gently to my left, we're talking just a few degrees, in order to deviate from the concrete runway in the distance. I was heading for a grassy stretch, like a big sort of grassy sort of stretch in the distance, and I run in towards that, nice and gently, but I'm trying to make descent as quick as I could, but I'm obviously having to do that as careful as I could to pull back on the stick, scrub as much ground speed as I dare, and then nose heavy again. So I'm sort of doing a combination of flare and pitch. I managed to scrub off, significant amount of airspeed, and then I've knocked the throttle off. But what I've also done, simply put, is I'd followed the emergency protocol. A simple protocol that the US flight instructors had taught me again and again and again. And I'd practiced it in sort of dry training many times over. So I'd turn the key to the ignition off. The red switch is magneto, alpha, bravo, off, off. Master switch off, lights off, strobes off. Fuel pump in the center column off, and rotate fuel selector valve through 90 degrees off. I remember it clearly because it was a drill that I practiced again and again and again in the air. I just never really had to use it in the emergency sense. So I'd memorized that sort of dashboard from left to right, and I knew that was the kind of the configuration, and that was the way to do it. Follow the dashboard simply from left to right, and jobs are good for emergency protocol, right? So I'd shut everything down to, if you like, kill the engine, kill the instrumentation and control. We were now very much in glide, and I've got still momentum of prop still spinning as I'm gliding in at a very low level. So we're talking 50 feet, having already unbuckled 3-point harness, having already opened the left-hand canopy door to the vertical position, and ripped off my headset and tossed that in the opposite footwell, so that the flex lead cable was kind of out of my way and eliminated. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, looking forwards, looking at the grass, looking left, looking right, looking for any obvious hazards or obstacles. I was able to clamber up onto the seat at approximately 20 feet, climb over the door lip to my left, through the open door aperture, get onto the left wing, and I estimate that I stood on the wing momentarily at probably about 15 feet because she was still dropping out, and I'm still gliding in at estimated 30 knots at that stage, but managed to get onto the wing, balance myself feet shoulder width apart, clap my hands together in prayer position as I took a giant leap off the back of the left wing. And I'm doing, like I mentioned, 15 feet above the ground, coming in at 30 knots. I got away with that at the skin of my teeth. I did that because the cockpit was a blazing inferno, and I jumped ship, as it were. And the obvious thing was jump now, because that fire's going to overwhelm you more and more. And at the point at which I exited the aircraft, the fire was actually lapping my face, my neck, my scalp. And as I mentioned, when I got on the wing also, it's worth noting that I received the backwash of the prop. So all the way down the right-hand side of like head, scalp, shoulder, my right of shin area, because I was only wearing shorts and t-shirt and sort of boots and socks for sort of hiking boots. So a lot of my body was exposed. And the upshot was, having made the jump, I made a big impact into the ground. Thrust forwards, the ideology was to roll out a good old-fashioned sort of parachute exit, parachute landing position. That was the sort of mindset, having been sort of a well-trained sort of special forces paratrooper sort of back in the day. I'd done all of that, and that was the sort of thinking, that was the mindset, and that I could possibly get away with the jump. However, it was too fast, and the landing was too sloppy. In essence, feet first on contact, which was great, but then I thrust forward in momentum, smashed my face on the grass, and I was thereby a bilateral nasal fracture, supraorbital eye socket fractures, multiple facial tissue lacerations from the sharp Florida razor grass, hyperextended left index finger fractured, 2 ribs on contact with the impact of ground fractured, clavicle, which is collarbone, fractured. In the action of the kinetic force coming through the body and the torso area, if you will, large intestine, colon, ruptured. My liver, one flank of my liver, was also lacerated from that massive impact. So liver was now was now bleeding and hemorrhaging internally. Colon was also torn and ripped. Multiple facial fractures, as I'd mentioned, and other fractures to the body. But the worst of it, for the record, above and beyond all of that, what I later found out in terms of medical diagnosis, I was 63% 3rd and 4th degree burn, for the record. And that is a life changer. That cost me, so any sense of, the possibility of returning to any active military service or potential, dynamics of everyday police service, not happening. Not when you've got that level of medical trauma going on. And by now, I was actually rendered, as a result of the depth of burns to my lower limb, especially because I took about 45 seconds of burn in the cockpit to my shin area and the lower limb. That forced surgeons, and they were therefore compelled to remove muscle and nerve from the lower legs. And that rendered me with bilateral sort of nerve damage. And again, any sort of operational military service or otherwise was rendered null and void at that stage. It's not so much of a sob story, but it's a case of, look, I was hit really, really bloody hard, and any essence of who I was before, i.e., the sort of badge guy, Jamie Hull version 1.0, gone. So I had to really think outside the box and sort of choreograph my own recovery and move forward at that stage.
I've got so many questions.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, thank you so much for sharing that story. It genuinely is incredible. I mean, I've got questions starting from when you were still back in the plane.
I've got loads of questions from back in the plane.
Fire away.
Just the first one, from noticing the fire to the plane getting on the ground, what sort of time frame was that?
I estimate that it was probably it was probably a good solid 45 seconds of flame that I took within the confines of that cockpit.
And then, looking back at that moment you spotted the fire, what was going through your head?
My mind was literally racing, and at first it was an abject panic that was definitely going on internally, the internalization of and trying to process all of that. And I was literally flustered and like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? My God. And then what I mentioned was I became consciously aware of the panic stations that were going on in my mind mentally. And in essence, how I dealt with that was because I'd been there many times over. I'm not talking about in that moment in a cockpit. That was the first time it had happened to me. But where I had been many, many times over, having been a former, as I mentioned, special forces kind of operator, and I'd done, for example, I jumped out of aircraft in various locations around the world, from temperate locations to the Arctic. And believe you me, when you're just about to jump out of a perfectly good, back in the day C-130 Hercules, and it's all coming on top, and you're in the back with your muckers, and you're just about to make that jump, there's not a bloke amongst us that is not thinking about it, that is not scared. It's controlled panic. Yeah, the reason why it's controlled is because you've been trained, and moreover, you've been recently ground trained. So they do a combination of whether it's the Royal Air Force or whether it's the Swedish guys that I work with or whatever. They've drilled you again and again and again. Why do they do that? They do it to manifest a level of confidence. You're still going to go up there and veritably shit yourself, because you're just about to jump out of the aircraft in those cases. And I've got a container strapped to my kneecaps, which is significant weight. We're talking sort of 45 pounds of weight. I've got other aspects of uniform and equipment without going into all the nitty gritty of that. I've got, I've sort of, a battle grade sort of helmet on. I've got it all going on as an operational kind of soldier. And not only that, the noise, the sort of frantic nature of jumping from perfectly serviceable aircraft, low level, might I add, it conjures up significant amount of panic and significant amount of concern, like cognitive concern is going on. And believe me, your mind is processing, your mind is rationalizing based on all of the above, based on the training, based on the recent ground training to sort of prep you to get over that hurdle. And believe me, you might be a qualified paratrooper or whatever, but if you haven't been perhaps recently drilled, and I'm going to, touch on this. So in my case, having been a paratrooper and been recently drilled by the Royal Air Force at Brize Norton, or recently drilled by the Swedish guys in their equivalent over there, or in America with the US guys over there before I make the jump, or having been in Florida doing the flight training and recently drilled by the US flight instructors regarding emergency protocol, it might not have happened. So the combination of panic caused me to perhaps recognize the panic, but also to get a grip. And I also learned when I went through like Royal Military Academy, and you're being drilled and you're being grilled and you're being put under a lot of pressure. How do you make good on that pressure? How do you rationalize? How do you internalize? How do you come up with a game plan that's not going to cause you to effectively crash and burn in the moment? Yeah, it is fall back on the training. Think about what it is that you're being asked to do and not be afraid. Try to rationalize that. Try to work with the process of the moment and and deal with it as best you can based on the options that you've got available to you. You know, at Sandhurst, we were told, look, you've got the option. Do you want to go left flanking? Do you want to go right flanking? Do you want to go straight down the middle? And do you want to try and execute in that sense and pull off the little firefight, in this case, against a couple of, well-trained Gurkha soldiers? You know, it was that kind of scenario. You know, you've got some options. Which is the best option do you foresee to try to make it happen and sort of effectively win the firefight and get from point A to point B and take out that little bunker? When you're talking about within flight, in my case, in Florida, there weren't many options. But one of the options I had, am I going to go for the threshold of the runway? But based on the timeline that was running and based on the amount of burn that I'm already receiving, am I going to go for that? I've still got 500 feet to drop, right? Or am I going to do something a bit irrational here and think outside the box? That was the option I took. And you could say, in part, in gratitude to the military service that perhaps gave me that mindset, gave me the option to make that plan B, if you will. And that was what I chose to do, to try to get out of there a bit quicker, out of the heat of the moment, as it were. So, listen, it's not, in my case, it's not by no means of a boast. This is what I was able to pull off. It is a case of I was faced with some hideously dire options, and it came to me as a bit of an option within the cockpit that, okay, I might just be able to get away with this if, and then followed by sort of Alpha Bravo Charlie to exit in order to execute that, you know.
Sorry, just one question.
Yeah, go.
Realistically, what are the chances of surviving something like that?
Honest answer? Jesus Christ, like 0.1%. I'm telling you that now. Based on what I pulled off in the air, so I don't need to perhaps reiterate too much for the benefit of like a listening sort of audience here. Me getting out of that cockpit in the manner that I did, relatively sort of, I say relatively graciously, but albeit hitting the ground like a sack of spuds. And then creaming in, and then multiple fractures, internal injuries from all the force and the tear internally. And then massive third-degree burns. And not just that, in fact, fourth-degree burns. So I mentioned the shin area where the burn started. And so the shins were taking the bigger burn, and what the surgeons had to do for me in America and cut out shin muscle and nerve and blah, blah, blah. I was massively up against it as a result of the trauma. So much so that I can for a fact tell you that the surgeons in America gave me only 5% probability of survival. They do that in a rudimentary sense based on your age. So I was 32 years when it happened, just turned 32, and the 63% third and fourth degree burn, fact, in terms of medical diagnosis of total body surface area. That's just an observation that the doctors make. They add the two together. If you do the maths on that, it's 95. The remainder is your probability of likely survival. So how I defied very slim odds of 5%, I couldn't tell you. What I can tell you is that I was also a very, very fit, physiologically fit and motivated young guy. I was as fit as a butcher's dog by virtue of what I did for a living at the time, and I was very well trained. I remember, like literally the night before, I was out for a 10K run, like 6 miler, just for practically shits and giggles. But I did it to maintain myself. Again, it's not a boast. It was a case of like I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the physicality of being out. Remember, from a young age, athletics, the interest. So I love to train. I still do. I still love to walk and hike. I'm not a runner anymore, but love to hike, love to hit the pool a few times a week. So it's in me. It's kind of innate. That guy is still in me. I'm just not quite the same athlete. But back then, I'm doing a 10K run. But what was that giving me? That was giving me sort of superior fight, if you will, come the day of the race, come the day of that action that I described. And with that, boy, did I have to fight. My God, did I have to fight.
Yeah.
I mean, I fought like 10 men. I literally fought like you would not believe. And I held on like the analogy that I would use, you've got the owner. with the little piece of rope, and he's got one of these little terriers, like Jack Russell or something, yeah? And he takes the rope and he dangles it. The terrier bites on, yeah? The owner then lifts the rope. He might be a tall guy and he lifts it like 6 feet or so in the air. What do you think that terrier is going to do? He's going to bite on and he's going to hold on. Before you know it, the terrier's airborne. And he's like thrashing around holding onto the rope. You can see that, right? That was me. I was that guy. I was like the terrier on the rope, come what may. Even before that incident, I was the terrier. I would hold on. Give me a scenario, I'm with the blokes, or I'm on my own, and I'm put in under a bit of pressure, I'm going to hold on. Hence why, again, it's not a boast, but hence perhaps why I was successful with, I did a P company. I got a stand-up pass. That was parachute regiment selection. I did Royal Military Academy. I got the stand-up pass. I did UKSF selection. I surprised myself because it's a long road. It was like a year plus of my life. I got the stand-up pass. That meant I was a terrier. And again, it's not a boast, but it was who I was. You know, remember the kid running around the athletics track when he was 12 years of age, 54 laps.
You don't know when to stop.
I wouldn't give in unless someone was going to pull me and tell me to stop. You know, I was that guy. I was the terrier at all costs. I held on. I bit onto that rope. So when I got injured, that played into my hands. It was a most hideous thing that I went through. And, I mean, I looked grotesque. I mean, I've even got images to prove this. I've got images, like, in the book, you know. And, you know, within the first 24 hours, I looked like something that that divers had fished out of the River Thames. I'm not joking. I looked like a, you know, deceased cadaver. I was swollen to like twice the size of human being, but I was still alive. What the Americans had done for me, they put me in drug-induced coma for 6 months. It was that bad. The cost, incidentally, on the insurance was just shy of $2.8 million to give people an understanding and an indication of what I went through and what the US medical services had to do for me. Fortunately, I was airlifted from the scene.
How quickly did they get to you?
Within around about 20 to 25 minutes. And I've got an ambulance on scene, first of all, because I hear the radios going off and the sort of, you know, the voices on the emergency radios. And I figure, Jesus, it's like Hollywood response because, I mean, literally, I didn't know because at that stage I was immediately blinded from the reaction of what happened in the cockpit with the burns. So I couldn't really see with the burn to the cornea tissue of my eyes. So my eyes reacted. I was blind. And so you can imagine what my mental state was. It was grim. And I heard the ambulance coming within sort of 10 minutes. And I'd been holding on for like grim death. And I grew cold and I grew weak. And the sirens grew louder. And I'm thinking, Christ, they must be coming from me. And I just held on with everything that I had. And I was hyperventilating and I was getting weaker. And the fluids were kind of draining from me at a rate of knots because of the big burn to all the tissue. Anyway, sirens grew louder, ambulance on scene. Before you knew it, there was like a couple of fire engines. I could hear all the engines. And then there was a couple of like squad patrol cars with the local police. As I say, ambulance. Ambulance obviously called it in. So there was a chopper on scene within about 10, 15 minutes. And it was like the chopper landed, there was this unmistakable downdraft. And they pushed me from a stretcher at that stage into the side of the chopper, closed the doors. It was a bit quieter, but I could still hear kind of rotor blades, and then all of a sudden this like whoop, 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 whoop. And the chopper's lifting off and it's also oscillating. So I'm feeling this like movement, that oscillation of the chopper, where there's a bit of crosswind and she's taking off. And then the doctor in the back of the helicopter, and I kid you not, and I quote, "Hey man, I'm Dr. Smith. I'm here to take care of you. Can you confirm your name?" I told him my name. He said, "Can you confirm your date of birth?" I told him. "Do you have an insurance policy?" Clearly, there was good reason why he asked me that question, right? Otherwise, they probably would have dumped me in some municipal clinic, I found out later on. And they probably would have wrapped me up and given me some serious pain relief. But they wouldn't have been able to do a lot for me. So the truth of the matter is, I ended up getting, because of, you know, the situation and because of, let's just say, some good backing, perhaps with you know, the powers that be, the military and so on and so forth, and a damn good insurance policy. I mean, you don't do anything remotely hazardous. You don't even go hiking in the States without an insurance policy. I mean, even stepping off the sidewalk and twisting your ankle could mean disaster if you don't have an insurance policy.
Yeah.
Hint, hint, that's a good bit of advice for everybody out there. That's the America for you. They're not subject to National Health Service, as we know. But, I was very, very fortunate to get picked up in the way that I did. I was also super fortunate that we're talking probably, arguably, world's best trauma and medical facility. Why? Because Florida is an adventure playground. So they get a lot of vehicular traffic. They've got, motorcycles, Harley Davidson, motorcycle racing, Speedway, Daytona, lots of aviation. Some of the most aviation traffic on planet Earth is in and around that region of the US.
I find the aftermath just incredible, that you're capable of holding a conversation with the guy in the helicopter. What then comes next? So they take you to the hospital. What's life like for you? You get put into the induced coma. What comes next?
So it was really a case of me holding on, like I mentioned. I don't remember much about America. I remember, maybe one female American voice, and she would have been perhaps the lead nurse, the clinician that was choreographing and taking ownership of my case, my medical case, as it were. I don't remember too much more. I had, by all accounts, a lot of friends and family, and particularly my mum, who was kind of there orchestrating my case and being my sort of number one sort of spokesperson over there. With regard to the doctors and so on. Lots of visitors came and went, but I really don't remember. They're very, very good at what they do, and they can titrate, so they can bring you in and out of that drug-induced coma. So you can have conversations with people, friends, family, medical professionals, lawyers, etc. It was all going on, but I don't remember really much, to be fair. Right. They got me back to the UK, then I start remembering. Because what they've done effectively there is they've brought me out of the drug-induced coma on a step-down unit in Chelmsford in Essex. And suddenly I've got this kind of Essex nurse, with the accent. All right, Jamie, we've got to get you moving now. We've got to get you sort of sat up in bed, and we've got to get you kind of, rehabilitating. And I'm like, where am I? And it was like just abject confusion. And I think that she probably thought that I wasn't complying. So she quickly opened a window. This was like February 2008, right? The window, the cold air rushed in. And I'm like, oh my God. And she's like talking to me. And I remember snapping at her. And I'm not joking. I turned around and said, look, piss off. Leave me alone. Go and get my American nurse. Because clearly in the subconscious, that's what I was used to, right? Who was, I don't know, maybe a bit nicer in her approach. I don't know. The difference between private and National Health Service, I don't know. But I'm just joking. But the point being, this Essex nurse bending my ear, and I snapped at her, and she said, I'm sorry, Jamie, you're not in America anymore. You're with us now. You're in Chelmsford Burns unit in sort of Essex. And I'm like, my God. And suddenly, it was just like shock horror. It just it closed in on me. The whole scenario, it dawned on me like a wet fish slapping me in the face. It was like that dramatic. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I actually survived what I survived in America. I was dumbfounded. I just couldn't get it. It took me time to really process that. And then when it dawned on me, it was just hideous, because the next thing she did, this young lady, she bought me a mirror. And of course, I've got to check myself out for the first time. Human being, suddenly looking at myself in the mirror. And let's be honest, this was, by now, you might as well have called that day one Jamie Hull version 2.0, day one. And I was horrified. I looked like the distant cousin of the Elephant Man. And again, I'm trying to absorb that, internalize what I'm seeing, and absorb everything and process. And again, I was like this guy, you know, face was twice the size. It was red. It was blotchy. It was super swollen. And I mean, this was 17 years ago, almost, sorry, 16 plus years ago, when I woke up from that drug-induced coma. And I just didn't think I was going to be able to do it. I mean, the horror of seeing myself, that new guy. I mean, I was a pretty handsome guy before it had happened, right? You know, leading up to that moment in Florida. You know, I had like, you know, normal features, you know, all the good ears, the healthy ears and everything going on. It was a massive shock to the system. That's what I'm trying to say. And again, it took me a lot of time to come to terms with that. In truth, I probably didn't realistically fully come to terms with the big change in physical appearance and the scarring. That probably took me about 5 years, even though I would say it probably took me about 3 years to heal. But mentally speaking, and the cognitive sort of acceptance took longer. I'd say it took me about 5 years. But day one, I looked in the mirror and I had to get used to everything. And it was a really, really slow building blocks for me. 2 steps forward, at times 3 steps back. The hideous dynamics of all of the kind of mental side of it and all of the questioning. Why me? Why the hell did it happen to me? And again, something quite ironic was that I specialised as a patrol medic with my role with UK Special Forces that I touched on. So I specialised as this highly trained medic, and I knew my stuff. You know, I knew that sort of aspect of my craft within the sort of medical context, and I knew that meant what I was up against as a victim of major third-degree burns. And I thought, in all sincerity, I don't think I'm going to be able to survive this going forward. Even though I'd already survived for a period, I was still up against so much. To put it into context, I marched forward super slow, and I was subject to 64 surgeries under general anaesthetics. That meant they put me to sleep 64 times over a period of 7 years of my life. Human donor skin, pig skin, synthetic skin, my own skin, where they'd skin grafted me multiple times from various sites of my body. For example, they stripped the thighs, the back of the thigh. They stripped the backside, you know, my buttocks. They stripped aspects of my back that were still somewhat healthy. But remember, I was 63% third degree. I was lucky in the sense that genitalia didn't get it. That was a massive saving grace, I've got to say, from a guy's perspective. That meant that there was hope, and I was able to consider, like, you know, future in many respects and blah blah blah. But it was very much a huge journey of snakes and ladders. A lot of work with the surgeons and doctors. I went through orthopedic surgeons, so bone stuff. I went through a lot of soft tissue stuff with plastic surgeons. All kinds of different kind of interventional procedures. So all kinds of experts were looking after me, from general surgeons regarding aspects of torso where they had to go in and repair, remember, aspects of colon and musculature in the internal sense. So a lot of experts looked after me. There were a lot of failures along the way in the medical sense, like operations therefore that I had to repeat. And I can't tell you how frustrating that is in the Groundhog Day sense of the journey. It was very, very deeply frustrating. You know, you don't always get it right, whether it's kind of, you know, the success of the surgery and so on, but you've got to stick with the program, and you've got to trust the doctors, and you've got to trust the surgeons. And I'll be honest, at times I hated them. At times I hated the nurses, because they're there scrubbing my back down, and my back still resembled, you know, like a raw steak. And I'm having like salt buckets with the sponge, and I'm screaming the freaking house down. I'm screaming blue murder like you've never heard a man scream. You know, like I'm getting, you know, veritably tortured to the highest level with what was going on with the wounds and what those nurses were doing to me at times. And sometimes it got so bad that I would scream literally like I was under the most harrowing torture, because that's what I was feeling and that's what I was going through. And it got so bad that the surgeon would walk down the corridor. He'd walk in, like literally like grey-faced, like ashen. But he would be grey-faced, like scratching his beard, thinking, Christ, what am I going to do with this bloke? And then literally he would turn around and say to the nurses, stop. And he would say, okay, James. He said, right, I understand. He said, I'm taking you back to theatre. He said, we won't do it today, but I'll take you back, give you a rest tomorrow. And like, I'll take you back on Wednesday. We're going back to theatre. I'm going to put you down again. And then we're gonna scrub you and we're gonna debride you in theatre to get the if you like, all of that infection that's obviously plaguing you, hence the kind of screams, because I'm in so much infected wound, sort of pain and discomfort where they're trying to scrub it with the salt baths, etc. So we'll have to take you back to theatre. We'll debride you under anaesthetic, and that's what they had to do. But literally, you don't know the half of what I went through. So they do that, and then I lose like massive, significant volume of blood. In some of those ops, and one of those, when it was at its absolute lowest ebb, I lost, I think I lost 6 units of blood. And any decent medic will tell you that we're talking, a unit represents 500 mil. So that's a significant amount of blood where they've debrided me more or less down to the bone in places.
Wow.
And I'm on death's door. So this is why I was in hospital for 2 years. This is why I was subject to 64 surgeries under general anaesthetic. A lot of people don't get what major burns victims go through. And somehow, with the grace of God, with the humbling nature of some of the very best surgeons on the NHS, some of the very best guys in the US before them, and with me being that terrier on the rope, you know, the guy that didn't give up, the guy that held on at all costs and kept up the pretense of fighting the fight, I was able to come through over the course of a very slow, protracted sort of medical journey. And one thing I'll probably mention on that was that, you've got to want it. I mean, above all, you've got to want it. I mean, my bottom line is, with ultimate great will and determination, guess what? You might just surprise yourself. Think about some of those examples I gave you. I'm up against it, whereas I'm trying to, to fight through for, the journey on test week for P Company, whereas I'm trying to fight through to get the grade for Royal Military Academy, whether I'm trying to fight through as a kid on the athletics track, because I've got a goal, I've got a purpose, whether I'm trying to fight through for selection for SF or whatever, whether I'm trying to fight through to overcome trauma. How much do you want the process? How much are you prepared as an individual to fight for it? If you want something badly enough, you might just surprise yourself. And that's the bottom line.
Wow. I think that is genuinely one of the most interesting stories. And I know you're short on time, but I for one would love to have you back in another time to hear about
so many questions.
Time and life since, because that's just, version 1 of you. I want to hear all about version 2. So we'd absolutely love to have you back in again, if you have a chance. But James has a little question that we end every episode with.
I think you pretty much just answered it.
Yeah, I mean, you have essentially covered it.
The last question is more about life advice you'd give to the next guest, regardless of who they are or what they do. But we also ask you what you think of the previous guest life advice for you, for example. So the last person we had on was Dev. He's a TikTok influencer that creates comedy sketches, so a lot of a different background. But his advice was, it's not real. And that's regards to feedback people give online in terms of negative comments, but also around the likes, the engagement, the views, and all the sentiment around the stuff that people feed back. The stuff that matters is what your parents think, your friends think, and the people around you think. So what's your thoughts on that, but also what's your life advice for the next guest that comes on the show?
I mean, I think, in essence, life for me is very real. There's no two ways about that. I didn't ask for it. I wouldn't have wished it upon the enemy. And that is saying something. If you could take me back to sort of the soldier in me and the guy that had to be the aggressor potentially at times, I still wouldn't have wished what I went through, that journey, on the enemy. No human being should have to be subject to to kind of the journey that I experienced, the journey that I was subject to, what I felt, and what I had in terms of what I had to hold on with. Advice I would give to anybody, because I'm not unique in the world. I mean, I know many colleagues that I've met through military, I've met through like the veterans kind of charity sector, with charities like Help for Heroes, BLESMA, British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, could be Royal British Legion, etc. But many guys and girls, for that matter, have suffered, whether it's post-traumatic stress, whether it's physical trauma, and they might have lost limbs, they might have sustained head and neck injuries, head injuries, and so on. And, again, maybe the reason that they've survived is because they've surprised themselves. They've been extraordinary people, exceptional individuals. They've had the ability to hold on, despite, in some cases, being up against the greatest odds. Not just that, but if you look at society, I would suggest everybody suffers in life. Everybody goes through the mill. Even in everyday life, when you live a seemingly normal kind of existence, a normal, healthy kind of journey. But everybody at some stage goes through some level of trauma that they face. It might not be so obvious, but it might come later in life. It might be grief, where they've lost loved ones and family members, or grief in the sense that, their work, their job, their career doesn't quite work out, and they've got to redress the balance and think about reinvention and their own version 2.0. So my best advice to any others, really, whether it's your previous guest or guest going forward, is that never lose heart, never lose hope. When the chips are down, understand that there is potentially always hope, and never sort of lose sight of that ultimately. And again, if you believe in yourself and believe that there's a will and there's a way, and that you can make it, and perhaps you can switch direction and you can kind of reinvent, then it's all worth fighting for.
I like that.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Jamie. It's been absolutely fascinating. Is there any other projects or anything you're working on you'd like to shout out before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I always march forward as a speaker, so I get there's a fair amount of interest out there from smaller groups and organisations to kind of bigger corporates that I get sort of bookings with on occasion as a speaker. So I like to share the story in the wider sense with different audiences as well, but also on a personal note, a big thing for me, a big passion. I mentioned it way back in the podcast, but I spent some time as a younger man. My journey started in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef as a diver, and I went on to sort of take that to the kind of highest levels within the industry as an instructor. And I'm very passionate about some delivery on that as well. So this summer I had really, really good fortune to work with a Canadian charity called Freedom at Depth, which I'd like to give a plug to, because why they're special is they work with clients that have got major, very serious, life-changing disability. And I was working randomly, but really interestingly, with guys and girls that have got paraplegia, that have got quadriplegia, that's all 4 limbs paralysed. And I'll give you an example, but I even worked with a young NBA sort of protege that was on a scholarship in the US at one of the colleges there, and he'd been poached from Canada. So clearly he was a talent, right? And he was subject to a car crash with a friend of his, where it wasn't anything untoward. It was just that one night there was an incident and they drifted and they went into a bridge culvert, 85 miles an hour. The driver walked away, a few injuries to his jaw, etc., and his tongue, but he walked away otherwise from the trauma. Meanwhile, this guy, who was the young sort of NBA sort of protege in the making, he was a C5. So for the non-medics, that's the cervical spine, 5th vertebrae down, a C5 complete spinal cord injury. 18 years old, quadriplegic, all 4 limbs paralysed for life. So in essence, he's got a bit of shoulder movement, and that was it, a bit of head and neck movement, and he could bite down on a regulator, which meant the surgeon, the doctor could sign him off, he could get the medical clearance to go scuba diving, and I got to work with this guy as an instructor in Canada. Pretty special stuff.
Amazing.
And so, listen, you've got to realise that there's always someone worse off than you, but that's partly why I do what I do in the sort of the diving sense. And it's a massive privilege to be able to work with people like that in the world and to give a little something back. So in the philanthropic sense, it's kind of cool, but it's also a tremendous thing for me to be able to do before I get too old and I can't scuba dive anymore. Nice. So awesome stuff.
Brilliant. I love it. Jamie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Check Jamie out on socials. Check out his book as well, releasing in 2022. And thanks again for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks
Pleasure.
a lot, Jamie.
Great to meet you guys, and best of luck.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.